What if a life-changing key is understanding yourself?
Today's guest took a behavioural profile test that revealed not just who he was, but ultimately opened his eyes, supporting him to become who he is today.
We're going to be talking about how self-awareness might just be the most underrated power that you have.
Welcome, Damon Clark. Damon from Talent Optimizers. Tell us a bit about your journey from being miserable in marketing, joyful in sales, and finally a powerhouse in the world of behavioural analysis.
What a fantastic introduction. Thank you. Well, I wouldn't say I was miserable in marketing. I was just useless at it. So I think I was happy. I'm reasonably happy. Actually, yeah. I think I struggled because I knew I was doing a bad job. So I loved the people I was around. I loved the company. I loved the industry. But I sensed I was letting people down. So yeah, I think I was unhappy in that respect. So what happened was I worked later because I wasn't good at doing the job, so I had to put extra time in, and yeah, and definitely there was some stress there. But I did love the company and love the people. Eventually, my manager said, "Damon, maybe the sales team's a better spot for you." And I moved into sales, and rest is history. I kind of thrived in that environment and did very well. But looking back on it, there was some stress, and I was lucky because I think in normal circumstances you just get fired. I had an amazing manager who saw some potential and repositioned me. But I think 8 times out of 10, you normally get fired. And as a result, now in terms of the work I do, I now understand why I wasn't good at that job. But at the time, I had no idea.
So how did you learn about yourself, Damon? You mentioned previously when we did our podcast with you, Damon, that...
Hang on. We may need to explain that and give that some context.
Yes.
So, Damon, this is round 2 of our podcast, isn't it? The first one not being recorded. And I'm sure you told us that it was a sort of a behavioural analysis that really helped you to understand yourself better.
Yeah, so I moved into sales, and I was one of the top performers. I was going on the president clubs, but I always sensed my manager had a frustration with me, and I couldn't quite figure out why. And I actually did a DISC assessment, and it just changed my whole world. I realized my self-awareness was terrible. I realized my communication, I wasn't adapting my communication. And so when my manager said how I was doing, I'd give a very high level response. But after doing that DISC training, I realized that he was quite analytical and I needed to adapt my communication. So when he said, "How are you doing, Damon?" I'd say, "Hey, I'm 80% of my number. I think I'll finish on 120 at the end of a quarter. I need help with ABC." And as soon as I made that shift in communication, our relationship just got so much better, and I became obsessed with personal development, particularly behavior. And that's what I specialize in now.
Brilliant. So your manager was a details person. So when you learnt to speak detail with him, it worked.
Yeah. And it was for lack of self-awareness. So having that DISC assessment and having it on paper, looking at my strengths, looking at my caution areas, looking at my work styles, and then realizing not everybody was the same as me was that kind of light bulb moment. It totally changed my life.
Georgina, you're currently writing some chapters for our book about connection. And there's a bit that you were talking about previously about how we connect with ourselves and the importance of that, not it being like sort of navel gazing. Can you just expand on that?
So when we have an understanding of our thoughts, our emotions, our history, and our values, that can create an inner compass that guides how we show up in our relationships. So psychologists often talk about self-concept clarity, which is a fancy word for having a clear sense of who you are. And when you have that clear sense, you're steadier, you're less reactive to conflict, more confident in decisions, and more consistent in how you treat others.
Damien, I'd be interested in your perspective on this in terms of, I think I have a bit of a shifting sense of myself, but I've got some areas. Now, you were saying you don't call them blind spots anymore when we had a chat previously. Back of the t-shirt stuff.
Yeah. So we all have hard-baked DNA. So that's your hard-baked behavior. But we also stretch according to our environment. So your hard-baked behavior doesn't change much. But we call it self-concept. I think you referred to that. Your self-concept is how you believe you need to stretch according to others. That's a mouthful. How you believe you need to stretch according to others. So particularly in work environments, we often stretch, particularly leaders. So what we find is with leaders, you don't start off as a baby CEO or a little CEO and become a big CEO. You come from a finance function or a sales function. And then if you come from that sales function and you go into a CEO, you got to be comfortable with numbers and details. So we see a lot of behavioral stretch, particularly in leaders. So that's how we stretch. We got a hard-baked DNA behavior, and then we've got how we stretch according to others. And the second part, I think you spoke to about the back of a t-shirt. We called it back of a t-shirt. We have strengths and we have caution areas. And quite often those caution areas are things we're not quite aware of. Maybe, we're brusque, for example, in our communication. And, it's something we may not be too aware of.
Georgina and I were, now, if you were watching us, you'd have said bickering about this earlier, but I'm going to say Georgina and I were having a very interesting conversation about this earlier. And like you say about leaders, but setting up a business. So as you know, it's just the two of us at the moment. And we are totally having to stretch ourselves. And it's not for the eyes of others. It's just because we can't afford to pay somebody to do all the things that we don't like or aren't within our given
Our
DNA.
skill set.
Skill sets, yeah.
Yeah, so that's often where stress comes from. Think of it like, if you're stretching a little bit occasionally, it's like sitting, you can do it all day. If you're stretching a lot and the stretch is significant, that's like jogging, you can do it for a while, but eventually you get tired. If you're really stretching, like putting a left-hand person in a right-hand person's job, for example, maybe you don't like detail, you enjoy risk, you like to be fast-paced, you like variety in your day, but then you're having to do work which is very detailed, very consistent, the same task over and over again. That is totally different hardwiring. And if you're doing that for a long time, that's when you get stressed and go home exhausted and have problems. So yeah, we all stretch occasionally, but when that stretch is significant and for a longer duration, that's when we see people really kind of tapping out, or people not doing their job very well, or struggling with their job, or going home and drinking a bottle of wine, or getting stressed out.
I can imagine that can take us into a burnout type territory if that's happening consistently.
Well, yeah, 100%. And that right-hand person in left-hand person's jobs, I think, a good analogy. So what we want to try and do is we can use data and behavioral science to really understand the work that's being done and then that person. So we got the ability now to assess a job and look at the alignment to the employee or candidate and really work out where there's misalignment. And then we can use that data to give us insight to take some action on that. Do we really need to rethink that person's job and change it slightly? Do we need to get some support in? How can we support that misalignment? And that can help reduce behavioral stretch and stress.
Tell me about, what does it actually look like when you go into a company and you do this data analysis on the behaviours and the jobs and so on? What's the outcome of that? What then happens to the people? How do they dial things up and down?
Sure. And that example we used at the start, the marketing job, it was a very collaborative job. I'm very hardwired to be quite independent. It was a very detailed oriented job. I'm very hardwired to be more high level. So I just was, and I've actually done the analysis, and I'm happy to share it. But it's quite funny because the misalignment is crazy on it. But how it looks like, what we can do, what we usually do is we're normally brought into organizations because there's some disengagement. So they do an employee survey and the numbers are bad, or there's some dysfunction in the leadership team and there's problems and conflict. So we're often brought in because there's a challenge. And we can really quickly unpick what's going on. So we're able to understand jobs and alignment to people. We can also analyze teams and alignment to strategy. So we've got some great tools where we can analyze the team's collective behavior. So we can look at their strengths, their caution areas, their work styles. And then we can analyze strategy and then map that to that leadership team. So we can do it on a job level, on a person level, and we can do it on a team and strategy level. And what we often find is there is misalignment. Maybe it's a startup where the teams had to be very comfortable with innovation and agility. And over time, they've built some structure up and they need to be better at process and precision and results and discipline. And the team's not hardwired to think that way. Or employee experience is the other one. That's quite a common one where we see that the team's very task orientated, very driven, very comfortable with risk, not very good at detail. But the company's structure, they need some team and some people focus. So, and that's not where they're hardwired. So we can kind of take that data, we can provide that awareness, then we can start action planning. Well, what can we do about it? And as you said earlier, sometimes companies lose an amazing talent where they've kind of inherited that job. And then instead of losing that talent and all that great intellectual property, we can just reposition them. And that's what we do with some of the data and some of the science and tools we use.
That sings into what we're doing at Minds Thrive as well. We use an analogy of the soil being your people and the harvest or the crop being your business. And actually, you don't need to take all the soil out if your crop is changing, but you need to think about the nutrients and how you look after the soil to get that healthy crop. If they're thriving, then your business is going to thrive.
It's scary. If you look at all these Harvard Business Reviews and Wall Street Journals, and when they interview CEOs on their biggest problems, always people problems, always. But then when we really look at organizations and how they're set up, there's very little emphasis and focus on people. Some organizations have an HR department. And if we think about HR, HR started to hire and fire. It's very kind of tactical service. It actually started to mitigate risk from factories. But now it is kind of it soaks up lots of different areas. But quite often we find out an HR person isn't even on the board. So we often find there's very big demand and acknowledgement that the biggest challenge organization have is people, but there's very little focus on people in organizations. So we're now starting to see a lot more kind of strategic people managers, and CHROs are a lot more strategic and tactical and really thinking about the people. And our job really is we do a bit of strategy work. We start to do a lot of strategy. Our main focus is making sure the people are aligned to execute that strategy. And that can take a number of forms, from comp and benefits, reward and recognition, DEI, training, development, employee engagements, performance management. So there's a lot of things in that little piece, but that's where we focus. There's work to be done, and then how do we support the talent to execute that work? And if we do that right, that's when we see the organizations flourish and thrive and people are happier.
And there's different types of people. Obviously, there's different types of people, but there's ways that you describe them. And that was another thing Georgina and I were bickering about earlier, about what we are. Are we explorers? Are we cultivators?
Ruth, the book that you're talking about is Mike Zarni's book, The Science of Dream Teams, and he talks about different personality types: explorers, cultivators, producers, and stabilizers. It's a fascinating area. Damon, tell us more.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start off with a little bit of the history on behavioral science. Behavioral science has been about hundreds of years. The big growth areas in the 1900s, when basically we were trying to figure out what our other leaders were doing during the war and trying to figure that out. So the government's pumped a lot of money into trying to understand behavior. But now there's about 200 behavioral companies out there. There's a lot. Some of them, one of them even relates you to an animal. So you can be a Jack Russell or a poodle, but only a handful are really validated. So if you're an organization, I recommend using a proper scientifically validated assessment for legal reasons.
I like the dog one, and Ruth would be a Springer Spaniel.
You'd be a Jack Russell.
Well, it's easy to remember. So going back to those reference profiles, what I like about one we use DISC, Myers-Briggs, but one I prefer is predictive index, because it kind of gives you a name, like a maverick or a artisan or an altruist or a strategist. So we can't put billions of people into 17 reference profiles, but it just gives you a really easy way to remember. So if I'm a maverick, I'm a predictive index maverick, so I'm comfortable on the fly, I'm good spontaneous, I'm comfortable with ambiguity. In a work situation, I may want some information from someone and I'll go up and interrupt them. Now, if that's a scholar who I'm interrupting, by that name, we understand something. They like to be focused, don't like to be interrupted. So that's where friction comes from if we don't know about this. Now knowing I'm a maverick and having that self-awareness and knowing I'm going to speak to a scholar, I may want to send a meeting invite, send an agenda, send the data up front. And that's how I'm going to have a more productive conversation. So understanding that terminology just helps me implement some strategies to have better working relationships. So that's the first part. By the way, those reference profiles are split up into analytical, stabilizing, persistent, and social profiles. And it's important to remember it's not a diagnosis, it's a dialogue. It just gives you a starting point for a conversation. So that's what I like about those reference profiles. It just gives you an easy way to understand yourself and others.
That is really helpful. And I'm one of those, like, I am a planner. If I'm doing a talk and I'm in flow, I'm like, don't interrupt me. And that's because I've got quite an ADHD brain. And if I go off on one tangent, I may never get back to what I wanted to complete.
So we call that the scientific, we would class that under patience, which is the drive for consistency and stability. So you're likely to be low consistency and stability, where you like some variety. There's some ADHD stuff in which we don't measure, possibly. That's kind of outside the drives these assessment measures. But you're most likely low C, where you like variety and change. Whereas someone who's high C or high patience like that consistency and stability. So that could be where that comes from. But what we want to do is we want to use that strength. So, we definitely want to reduce the impact of those back of a t-shirt elements. So the things which can cause problems sometimes, we want to understand that and reduce the impact. But we also want to use those strengths, because if we can use your basically your superpowers, you're going to go home happier. You're going to be more engaged. We're going to help with retention. You're going to you are hardwired to want to use those strengths. And that's another thing we can do with trying to understand your natural behavioral drives.
Well, that is fascinating. So Ruth and I got caught up in quite a conversation about explorers, cultivators, producers, and stabilizers. The lovely Scott that you put us in touch with, who did a bit of an analysis on us. So we took kind of two core things from that. And the word that kind of defined me was ship it, which we use now. And Ruth was more of a nurturer, I would say. Would you add to that, Ruth?
Yeah, I'm more of a nurturer, and I don't know. The first one kind of stood out to me as well, that explorer. So I think Georgina and I, the strengths is that I might say, oh, look at that. And then Georgina will go, right, let's build it. And she'll start building and I'll be like, right, no, look at that over there. And she's like, no, come back here. We haven't even We haven't even
We haven't
started
finished
on this one yet.
Yes, there's two behaviors appearing in that. The first one is patience again, where your high patience, so that drive for consistency and stability, they're your starter finishers. And then your low patience is the starters, not so much finishers. So that comes from the drive for consistency and stability and which end you're at. The other part is formality. So that's the behavioral drive to follow rules and structure. So on the high side, you've got this need to follow those rules, have that structure, have that playbook and stick to it. On the low side, you're going to color outside the lines a lot. So think of it. Do you get those food parcels at HelloFresh or Blue Apron?
I've had them in the past, yeah.
Yeah. So this is an example I normally use in explaining it. My wife, when she gets one, she gets the box, she gets the menu out, she puts all the vegetables and meat in an order, and then she gets a pen and she follows the recipe and checks it off as she goes. She's very high D, follows rules and structure. Me, I'm super low D, so I'm not very good at following rules and structure. So I open the box, empty it on the counter, throw the instructions away, and just try and guess how to cook it according to what I can see. So that's two different behavioral types. And of course, you imagine where the friction can come from. And the example I use is Captain Kirk and Spock from Star Trek. And I apologize using a Star Trek reference, but initially their story arc is they don't get on very well, but in time they realize their differences are their greatest strengths. So that's what's probably happening with both of you. We have some behavioral differences, and you've realized actually we complement each other. And also you can get magnified behavior when you're similar as well, which can cause its own problems. But that's what I think is probably happening, is you've got a really good working relationship because you complement each other.
That's much kinder than how we were talking to each other earlier. Oh, you're good. I'd ship you in to sort out our company if we had some money.
So another thing that we have spoken about in our previous pod was healthy conflict versus artificial harmony, and I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so we do a lot of work in trust, and particularly vulnerability-based trust, not predictive trust. We do a lot of trust, work in trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, and strategic mindset. And what we find often is how behavior impacts trust and conflict. So on the conflict side, what we get is we often get in teams, we can get unhealthy conflict, or we call it mean-spirited conflict, and that comes from the behavioral drive. Usually, it's dominance. But you get some people who are behaviorally driven to influence people and results, and then you get other people who are very collaborative. Also, you get some low extroversion who don't like to make decisions quickly. They like to take time and reflect. So unpicking that behavior, often you get the mean-spirited conflict, or on the other end, you get artificial harmony, which is even worse, which destroys teams. What we want is that healthy conflict. So by understanding the behavior and using that insight and awareness, we can start to understand different styles and adapt accordingly and try and get that healthy conflict and avoid that artificial harmony, which we see as a bad thing.
Because when I reflect on we sort of joke about our conflict because we actually get on very well. But when I think about when we have had like proper antlers locked over silly things and big things as well. And when they're locked, I think the thing that helps us is that we know that our values and our drive and our goals, we're wanting to head in the same direction. We both passionately believe about what we're doing, about helping people, about taking all the knowledge and skills that we've got from decades of clinical work. We want to take it out into the workplace. We want to, and we're like, that's what we want to do. The fact that we don't know how to do IT, we don't know how to do marketing, we don't know how to do all of that means that that's the stuff we're clashing over. And so do you find there's, I suppose what I'm thinking is, I think shared values and shared direction and shared motives, is that something that you look at in terms of the behaviours and the clashes?
We do. So often, as I said earlier, when we're brought into clients, because there's an element of dysfunction and lack of engagement possibly, but where our starting point is, our job is to build a talent strategy to support business strategy. So we look for first starting point is looking at whether there's a robust way of developing, implementing, and tracking strategy, which usually in organizations, there more often than not, there isn't. And that's a big problem to get sorted first. So we do a little bit of work there. But within that work, our starting point when we do our strategy offsites is mission, vision, values. And that's the real foundation for any organization. If they're locked in and strong, then everything else seems to fall into place. And just like your example gave, you're very locked in on your mission, vision, values. So that's often a starting point. And sometimes we notice organizations don't give them the focus they deserve, or just think it's a check mark on a list that has to be done. So we can often spend a day just on values. And then from the values, we'll look into how you hire on those values, how you do performance reviews on those values, and how you fire on those values. And those values become everything you do. And that's how you start creating a healthy workplace and building a really strong culture.
Fascinating. Thank you, Damon. Can I add something about neurodiversity? There's a lovely book by Maureen Dunn called The Neurodivergent Edge. And she talks about what I think is artificial harmony. She's saying actually a lot of problems in company comes about because of groupthink. People don't dare share an alternative perspective. There's an energy going in this direction and people get sucked in along with it. And she says there's so much value in neurodivergent people, because neurodivergent people, not everybody, but sometimes are much more able to label what they see and put kind of the harmony of the group as secondary. And they can really help stop a plan that is detrimental to a company by being really honest.
Yeah, so there's a few things that play into that. So trust, vulnerability-based trust plays into that as well. If we and psychological safety. So if we haven't created, so being a high-performing team doesn't magically happen. We need to work at it. And it's not just, a random training session on an offsite. It has to be a real kind of plan on where we want to get to, how we can get ourselves there. Let's benchmark where we are. And their trust is a big issue. If we don't feel safe to make a mistake and there's not psychological safety there, then we're not going to have those conversations. So I think the example you say, if you are neurodivergent, there's some occasions where you are going to jump in. You're going to jump in and say what you feel. And there's a benefit to that, a huge benefit. Ordinarily, we get that artificial harmony where you get those people, I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not worth a hassle. We don't want those environments, because often everyone's thinking, well, we need to pump on the brakes here. This is going to be a disaster. We've not thought about A, B, and C. And then you've got a bunch of leaders who are comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with risk, they're fast moving, jump in, and then we've just wasted a whole load of resource, caused a lot of disengagement. Whereas if we could have taken a step back and created a safe environment to disagree, and I often call this, we teach something called a disagree and commit. Now, we don't want to agree to disagree, because that's passive aggressive. We want people to disagree. But ultimately, if a leader says, well, okay, I've heard you, that's what we want to hear. On this occasion, I'm going to pull my CEO card and I want you to do a disagree and commit. So we teach that phrase. But what we want in these teams is people to disagree if they feel they need to disagree. And we want to create those environments. And that's what builds high-performing teams. So I totally agree. I haven't read that book, but that doesn't surprise me that neurodivergent category and that diversity of that would enrich a team, just like much other diversity.
So, Damon, tell us a little bit about your mission. Better work, better world.
Sure. So I think this relates back to our starting point. So it's a nice little, bookmark maybe. So I do remember being that job, being stressed, and other jobs where I just wasn't quite getting it, and then I was putting in extra hours and feeling tired. And so when I kind of discovered the path I'm on now, I realize I can put people in the right seats. I can avoid people getting fired. I can help teams hit their goals. So I generally wake up in the morning excited about doing my job because I feel I'm making a difference to the world. And so our mission is Better Work, Better World, which we stole off one of our partners, Predictive Index, because I couldn't think of anything better. So that's our mission. And I think that's how we kind of connected, because we've got similar missions in life, just creating better, healthier workplaces. So that's our mission, and it's everything we do. We would rather, I'm not suggesting anyone else does this, but we've done a whole bunch of free consulting before because the client hasn't had the budget, but it helps us progress our mission, and that's more important than the money. And as a result, in the early days, I had some business partners or some relationships who were saying, Damon, you are absolutely crazy. Why would you do this? But those clients have come back and now they're spending money with us and they've referred us to other people. So it was the most bizarre little situation where we generally embraced our values and our mission, and it's kind of worked out well for us.
Thank you. I find that really encouraging, actually, because we're doing a lot of stuff for free. When we sit back and think about bigger pictures and reasons and why are we doing this, it's like, actually, yeah, there is stuff that's way more important than sort of bringing in the cash.
And I feel it's, maybe it's a different podcast, but you get all these business gurus giving you advice, and it's funny. I always think, well, if they're trying to build a business of giving people advice, what happened to their business? Like, why did they stop being so successful themselves to advise you on how to do it? And I know the answer is it's easier to do that than to do your own business. So reality is building your own business is really hard. You need a bit of luck, and it's not as easy as we'd think. So yeah, sometimes you just go hustle and do what you can and build that network. And that's how we did it. In the early days, we would look for any opportunity to help anyone. And then eventually we started, turning at kind of pivot point where we started to grow a lot. But I think it goes back to that we generally are doing what we're doing for the right reasons, not for money. But getting paid's nice as well. We do like that.
It does help.
For us, it's an expensive hobby right now, isn't it, Georgina? One day it might be a job. Well, Damon, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'd love to come. I have so much fun on these sessions, so I'd love to come back. So
you would be very welcome. Yes,
we'd love to have you back, and we promise we will hit record always from now on.